Happy Monday, Bio 47, and welcome to the lecture portion for the endocrine system. So I'm going to be talking through an outline of chapter 29, which is about endocrine glands and the hormones they produce. And these endocrine glands are all these ductless organs that are secreting hormones into the bloodstream. And we'll talk about what that means. So endocrine glands and exocrine glands, which we've talked about before in the context of the integument, they're both these structures that are of epithelial origin, and they're products that make a secretion, so they're epithelial secretory tissues. Those ones on the right are exocrine glands, things like sweat glands, sebum glands, breast milk glands, and these are glands that have ducts, that is, openings to the outside, that allow them to secrete products in their local environment through that duct. Endocrine glands are that same epithelial secretory tissue, but they're surrounded by tissues. They're all packed in. So they secrete products, and these products are hormones, they're infochemicals, and they secrete these into the interstitial fluid. That means the fluid outside of the cells, and these products make their way into the bloodstream. You'll see written in a lot of places that the endocrine glands secrete directly into the bloodstream, but that's not true. They really secrete into that interstitial fluid around the cells first and make those products make their way into the bloodstream. And by ultimately ending up in the bloodstream, these products that are produced by endocrine glands, they can act on tissues throughout the body, whereas these exocrine glands are making products that just affect the local environment, like sweat, like sebum. And the nervous and the endocrine systems have a lot in common. So they're both integration and control systems. And both of them have cells that act on other cells that are acting on target cells by way of releasing chemicals. So both the endocrine and the nervous systems function to communicate signals throughout the body to maintain a relatively constant internal environment. In the nervous system, as is shown on the left there, so as is shown over here, in the nervous system, you have one neuron that's acting directly on one or more target cells that it's in close proximity with. It's releasing a neurotransmitter across the synapse, like we talked about occurring at the neuromuscular junction. That means that this response is going to be really fast. It's going to be more precise. It's targeting specific cells more quickly. In the endocrine system, there are endocrine cells that are secreting products into the interstitial fluid and from there into blood vessels. And these can travel through the blood vessels and affect target cells all throughout the body. So it can be more of a global response across a huge number of cells and across body systems. The nervous system is going to be for things that are much faster, things that occur instantaneously, something like a reflex. If you touch a hot stove, pull your hand away, that's a nervous response. The endocrine system is going to be more body-wide, a slower response, things like your fight or flight response that can persist for minutes or more and affect multiple organ systems. So we'll be examining some of these organs and glands that are associated with the endocrine system. Some of them, shown on the left there, are exclusively endocrine glands. They only have endocrine functions. And some on the right, under the blue list, these have other functions as well. So we're going to talk about the pituitary gland and the hormones that it secretes, the pineal, thyroid, parathyroid, and adrenal glands. And in addition, we'll talk about some of these organs that have endocrine properties, like the hypothalamus, the thymus, the heart, kidney, gastrointestinal tract, and parts of the pancreas and the gonads. So you'll want to be familiar with these selected organs and glands. You'll know the hormones that they secrete and the very general functions of these hormones. So we've been talking about hormones. Hormones are the chemical messenger molecules that are produced by endocrine glands that travel through the bloodstream and affect target cells. A hormone can only affect target cells or organs, that is, target organs that have receptors for that specific hormone. Cells that don't have receptors for a specific hormone don't respond to that hormone. So this is important because hormones are traveling through the bloodstream. Basically, all of the cells of the body are exposed to them, but only some cells will modify their behavior in response to exposure to those hormones. So only cells with receptors. The master control center of the endocrine system is actually part of the nervous system. It's the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is a part of the brain, but it's a control center for the endocrine system. The hypothalamus secretes these regulatory hormones that control release of hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus releases hormones that can have positive effects or negative effects. And I don't mean bad or good. I mean hormones that cause another hormone to be released. That would be a positive effect, a releasing effect, or hormones that stop other hormones from being produced. And that would be an inhibiting effect, an inhibiting hormone. So it secretes these regulatory hormones that control the effects of other hormones. And the hypothalamus also directly produces a couple of hormones itself, that is oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. These hormones are made in the hypothalamus, but they're stored in and they're released from the posterior pituitary gland. And I'll get into the details of the pituitary gland in just a minute. So it's producing these two hormones, oxytocin, and oxytocin targets the reproductive system. It plays roles in social bonding. It's called the cuddle hormone. And it plays a role in childbirth and in breastfeeding. Antidiuretic hormone, ADH, it targets the kidneys where it causes reabsorption of water, conservation of water. And if you've ever drunk a good amount of alcohol and then you had to pee quite a lot, then you know about ADH. So alcohol is an ADH inhibitor. So when you drink alcohol, it inhibits the water conservation efforts of ADH, and it causes you to release a lot of water from the kidneys and ultimately from the urinary bladder. The hypothalamus, finally, controls the stimulation of the adrenal gland, and in particular, the center of the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla. And it excites the sympathetic nervous system, that's your fight or flight nervous system, and it stimulates the adrenal gland to secrete its own hormones. That's adrenaline or epinephrine, norepinephrine that causes that fight or flight response. So the hypothalamus is this control center of the endocrine system. So here's a diagram that's showing the hypothalamus, and there it is in the diencephalon, this mid-region of the brain. And this hypothalamus is all neural tissue. And here it's showing its various roles. So its first job is to produce those hormones that travel through the bloodstream to the anterior pituitary and change its activity, either cause hormones to be released or stop hormones from being released. It produces those two hormones, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, that get released from the posterior pituitary, and it stimulates the center of the adrenal gland, that's the center right here, to cause those fight or flight hormones to be secreted. So that fight or flight response is controlled indirectly by the hypothalamus by way of the adrenal medulla. So I said that the hypothalamus controls the activity of the pituitary gland. So this is the pituitary gland right here. And the pituitary gland is divided up into three main parts. Remember that the pituitary gland is sitting in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. So it's very well protected, telling you it's going to be really important in regulation of the body. And it's located just inferior to the hypothalamus, and it's connected by this tiny little stalk that it's dangling from, and this stalk gets a funny name. That's the infundibulum that connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. So there's an anterior pituitary shown here, which is responsible for secreting hormones under the stimulating or releasing effects of the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary, which releases hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus. And then there's this little part in the middle. This is the intermediate pituitary, or the pars intermedia, the middle section. And in humans, this is responsible for secreting melanocyte stimulating hormone, or MSH. And MSH stimulates the production of and the release of melanin. Remember we talked about melanin, that pigment that's produced by melanocytes in the skin and hair. So in the presence of light, this middle section, intermediate pituitary, causes melanocyte stimulating hormone to be produced. So we talked about the intermediate pituitary. The next part is the posterior pituitary. And the posterior pituitary is made of neural tissue. So it's a neural part of the pituitary gland. It's of neural origin, the same as the tissues of the brain. There's a neural connection, that is these neurons right here, between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. So these cells have their cell bodies up in the hypothalamus, but their axons, these long branches, extend down into the posterior pituitary. And when these fire, then they're releasing hormones right here in the posterior pituitary, releasing them into the interstitial space and into the bloodstream. So they're releasing oxytocin and releasing antidiuretic hormone from that neural tissue. And the anterior pituitary is more like a typical endocrine gland. It's made up of epithelial tissue, and it's controlled by regulatory hormones that are secreted from the hypothalamus. So these neurons up here, shown in purple, have their cell bodies in the hypothalamus, and their axons don't extend all the way down into the pituitary. Instead, they secrete their hormones into these capillaries, these tiny blood vessels within the infundibulum. Those regulatory hormones get picked up in those capillaries, and they flow into the anterior pituitary. So they get picked up and carried in the bloodstream just a very short ways. And these hormones cause the anterior pituitary to release a second set of hormones. So it's a two-step process. First, these neurons are releasing this red dot hormone up here into the bloodstream, and that red dot hormone is causing these epithelial tissues to release this black dot hormone. So a two-step process. The hormones released by the hypothalamus cause the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary, and these anterior pituitary hormones in turn travel throughout the body and affect tissues throughout the body. So this anterior pituitary, controlled indirectly by the thalamus, releases several hormones that stimulate other glands throughout the body to secrete other hormones. So really it's a multi-step process. One of the ones that gets stimulated from the anterior pituitary is thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone targets the thyroid gland, and that stimulates metabolism in tissues throughout the body. Prolactin, produced by the anterior pituitary, targets the mammary glands. It tells the body to make breast milk. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing stimulating hormone, these affect the gonads. So they affect the development and function of the gonads, that is the ovaries and the testes, and they affect the development of gametes, that is sperm and oocytes, a fancy word for eggs. Adrenocorticotropo hormone, or ACTH, that acts on the adrenal gland and causes the release of cortisol, a stress response hormone. Growth hormone is what stimulates the release of these growth factors from the liver and stimulates growth all throughout the body. And then also shown here is that melanocyte stimulating hormone in the intermediate pituitary that acts on melanocytes. So it affects melanocytes throughout the skin and hair. Other endocrine glands to be familiar with. One of them is the pineal gland. The pineal gland is a small cone-shaped body in the brain. It's in the posterior epithalamus near the third ventricle. And the cells of the pineal gland secrete melatonin. That's a hormone you might be familiar with if you've ever had trouble sleeping. It's a hormone that makes us drowsy, and it affects various tissues throughout the body. Melatonin production increases at night, and it helps set the circadian rhythm or your day and night cycle. The next one is the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is the largest gland that has exclusively endocrine activities, and it's located inferior to the thyroid cartilage. The thyroid cartilage is the Adam's apple of the throat. So if you see somebody's Adam's apple, that's the thyroid cartilage, and just inferior to that would be the thyroid gland, which looks sort of like a butterfly shape with left and right lobes that are hugging the trachea or the windpipe. And here it is in cadaver view. On the right, you can see the windpipe right here, the trachea, and up here, the thyroid cartilage, that Adam's apple, and then this sort of cottage cheese looking texture. That's going to be characteristic of endocrine glands. So that's the thyroid gland, just inferior to the thyroid cartilage. Your book goes into detail about thyroid hormones and lists a few. You just need to know thyroid hormone and calcitonin. And I'll talk about the cells that produce those two. So the thyroid is composed of these spherical structures called thyroid follicles, and they contain this jelly-like colloid fluid in their lumen, their open spaces. So you'll see these distinct ring-like structures because we're looking at just a cross-section of it. It looks like a circle instead of a sphere. And that's the follicle. The cells that make up the follicle, those simple cuboidal cells, are follicular cells. Follicular cells secrete thyroid hormone, and thyroid hormone stimulates tissues throughout the body and increases cellular metabolism. In between the thyroid follicles, so in this space right here, in this space right here, you'll see parafollicular cells, also known as C cells, the letter C. They're large endocrine cells in between the thyroid follicles, and they secrete calcitonin in response to elevated blood calcium. So if blood calcium is elevated, calcitonin targets bone tissue to reduce blood calcium by inhibiting osteoclasts and increasing calcium loss in the urine. So it's reducing elevated blood calcium. On the posterior side of the thyroid gland, so now we have a posterior view, there are these usually 4 per person parathyroid glands. So they're small glands about the size of a pea on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. And there's usually about 4 per person. The main type of cells in the parathyroid gland that we're going to be concerned with are the chief cells. The chief cells are really packed densely in the parathyroid tissue, and they secrete parathyroid hormone. Its action is to oppose calcitonin and to raise blood calcium. So calcitonin lowers blood calcium. Chief cells in the parathyroid gland secrete parathyroid hormone and raise blood calcium. And here's the tissues that it affects to do it. So this is showing how parathyroid hormone and how parathyroid hormone opposes calcitonin and raises blood calcium. So in step 1, blood calcium levels are low, and that's detected by these 4 parathyroid glands. When that calcitonin, or when the calcium level is low, then parathyroid hormone is secreted into the blood, and that's what's shown here with these purple dots. So it's actually secreted into the interstitial fluid and then into the blood. And then there's some organs that are targeted that respond to parathyroid hormone. So these organs have cells that have receptors for parathyroid hormone. So the first one is bones. In bones, osteoclasts become more active. They resorb bone tissue and they free up calcium, releasing it into the bloodstream. Another tissue that's affected are the kidneys. The kidneys help to retain calcium, and they help to prevent calcium loss in the urine. And lastly, the small intestine also has receptors for parathyroid hormone. And under the influence of parathyroid hormone, the small intestine gets more calcium uptake from the food. So as a result of increased activity in bone, kidney, and intestine, now there's more calcium ions traveling through the blood. That's indicated by the yellow dots over here. And this calcium is traveling through the bloodstream. And when those calcium levels rise, this is also detected by the parathyroid gland, and that limits the secretion of parathyroid hormone. So it stops blood calcium from being raised forever. The next endocrine organ is the thymus. The thymus is this bilobed structure that has 2 lobes. It's located within the mediastinum, so with the heart, with the trachea, with the esophagus, in the middle of the thoracic cavity. It's superior to the heart, and it's immediately posterior to the sternum. So it's shown here, sitting superior to the heart. The size of the thymus varies between individuals, but it's really much larger in infants and in children. That's what's shown on the right here, is the relatively large size in a child and reduced size in an adult. So it diminishes in size and diminishes in activity with age, especially after puberty. And this is because it's functioning to regulate and to maintain body immunity, and it targets white blood cells, causing their maturation. So it's involved in the development of the immune response over the development of an individual. The pancreas is an organ that we'll talk about a lot more when we get into the digestive system, because its primary function is exocrine release, exocrine secretions into the small intestine, where it's helping with the digestive system. But it also has some endocrine function. It releases some hormones into the bloodstream as well. So it sits between the small intestine over here on the patient's right and the spleen over here on the patient's left. And it has both exocrine and endocrine functions. It's composed mostly of exocrine tissue that are producing alkaline secretions into ducts that lead into the small intestine for digestion, but it also has some small clusters of endocrine cells. So we'll look at those. So it's a cartoon up here, but down here is a cadaver view showing the body of the pancreas spanning across the abdominal cavity. Again, it's got that sort of cottage cheese appearance characteristic of an endocrine gland. So in the pancreas, most of the tissues that are present are these ones that are organized into circles that you can see. Those are the exocrine cells, or the pancreatic acini, or here it's labeled pancreatic acinus. And these are the ones that are making those alkaline secretions for digestion. But embedded within those tissues are these islands of endocrine function. So they're called the pancreatic islets, meaning like a little island of endocrine activity. And these pancreatic islets have a couple of different hormones secreted by different cells. So the first type of cell is an alpha cell. And the alpha cell targets the liver It's secreting the hormone glucagon, and glucagon helps to raise blood glucose. So if you're a Pokemon fan, if you ever think about a Pokemon that has low energy, needs more blood glucose, and you say, go, go, glucagon, to raise the blood glucose. Another type of cell is the beta cell, and beta cells are what secrete insulin, and insulin helps to bring blood glucose back down. So alpha cells, glucose, raise by way of glucagon, beta cells, insulin, lowering blood glucose, and they're both targeting the liver. Delta cells secrete somatostatin, which is also known as growth hormone inhibiting hormone. It affects the pituitary and inhibits growth hormone. And we're not going to talk about F cells. And you'll learn in lab about how to distinguish these pancreatic acini that have exocrine function in the digestive system from these distinctly different colored regions of the pancreas under the microscope, the pancreatic islets, which have the endocrine function via the alpha, beta, and delta cells. A paired set of endocrine glands are the adrenal glands. These are glands that sit on the superior borders of the kidneys. And so there's one on the left side here and one on the right side here, again with that cottage cheese appearance, letting you know you're dealing with an endocrine gland. And here it is in cadaver view. Somebody's using a fork to pull back on some of the blood vessels. Here's the kidney right here, and the adrenal gland in that sort of cottage cheese appearance, sitting on top of the right kidney, sort of like a tri-corner hat. That's the adrenal gland right there. So now we're looking at a coronal section through the adrenal gland, and that allows us to see the 3 different layers of the adrenal gland. So each gland has an outer layer that's a connective tissue covering. That's the capsule. And the capsule doesn't secrete any hormones. It's just connective tissue. Then deep to that is the outer adrenal cortex and the inner adrenal medulla. And the cortex and the medulla secrete different hormones. So the cortex, here we've got a cross section again, capsule, connective tissue on the outside, and then the cortex, which is composed of 3 different layers or 3 different zones, and each of them produce different corticosteroid hormones. You don't need to know the details of these corticosteroid hormones. Just know the cortex produces corticosteroid hormones. They target tissues throughout the body. They affect the stress response, the immune response. That cortex, corticosteroids, and they're involved in various tissues throughout the body. Deep to that is the adrenal medulla, the gland's inner core. What's interesting about the adrenal medulla is that it is nervous tissue, just like the posterior pituitary is nervous tissue. Remember that endocrine tissues are mostly epithelial, but the adrenal medulla and the posterior pituitary, they're both nervous tissues. And what they're secreting as hormones is a neurotransmitter. It's made by neurons, by nervous tissues, but it's traveling throughout the blood instead of across a synapse, and that means it counts as a hormone. So the adrenal medulla secretes norepinephrine and epinephrine, aka adrenaline. This is where you get the name adrenal glands. And adrenaline targets basically all tissues throughout the body. It causes your heart to beat faster, causes your digestive system to slow down, causes your muscles to be ready to go. This is involved in your fight or flight response. So the adrenal medulla secretes these adrenaline hormones. Other glands that have adrenal or that have endocrine effects be the gonads. So the testes, which are found in the scrotum, they make androgens. These are masculinizing hormones, including testosterone. The effect of testosterone on the body, it affects some reproductive organs and their development, and also has some effects on behavior. So if you look at a section of testes under the microscope, you'll see these open spaces surrounded by columns of cells. And these are all the seminiferous tubules. These are a series of tubes where sperm are produced and mature. So they're responsible for making sperm. Where the hormones are produced, though, is in the interstitial tissue. So in these tissues, in these cells that are between the seminiferous tubules, interstitial tissue, this would be interstitial tissue. And that would be where those androgens, those masculinizing hormones, including testosterone, are made. Another set of gonads is the ovaries. And in the ovaries, located on either side of the uterus, this is where the oocytes, or eggs, start their development. So here's a developing oocyte, and it's inside of this big structure that's called a follicle. So a follicle, this open space that surrounds a developing oocyte. The cells that make up the walls of these follicles, they're called follicular cells, and they make estrogens, and that affects the development of reproductive organs and also has some effects on behavior. So just like inside of the seminiferous tubules, the development of gametes, that's not a hormone, and cells that are around it making a hormone. In this case, it's the follicular cells. In the testes, it was those interstitial cells. Once that egg is mature and has ovulated, that is, it's left the follicle, it's ruptured the walls of the follicle, and it's headed down the uterine tube, the follicle is left behind as the corpus luteum, also known as the white body. And the corpus luteum is made up of all of the remaining follicular cells, but now they don't surround an oocyte anymore, and they change their job. Now they produce progesterone, which targets the uterus and maintains the uterine lining in preparation for implantation of a fertilized egg. Finally, there are lots of organs and tissues throughout the body that secrete things that are by definition hormones, chemicals that travel through the bloodstream and affect other tissues. And some of these are things like the heart and the kidneys. Both the heart and the kidneys are intimately connected to the circulating blood, either by pumping it or by filtering it. And because they're so closely connected to the blood, they monitor and they regulate blood pressure and blood volume. So kidneys help to regulate electrolyte content, erythrocyte, that is red blood cell production, and blood volume and blood pressure. Calcitriol is the active form of vitamin D. It's made by the kidneys. And if blood calcium is low, then it stimulates calcium uptake in the intestine. Kidneys also make erythropoietin, which raises the rate of erythrocyte, that is red blood cell production, when red blood cell concentrations are low. And renin is an enzyme that helps to form angiotensin II. Angiotensin II is involved in water conservation, and that helps to maintain blood pressure. Cells of the heart atrial cells, those upper chambers of the heart, they secrete atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP, and that increases sodium and water excretion and helps to lower blood pressure. So if blood pressure is too high, the heart releases hormones that help to get rid of salt, get rid of water. Additionally, the gastrointestinal tract has all of these internal checks and balances by way of hormones. It's a long tract through which food is traveling, and the organs communicate with each other by way of hormones. So they secrete hormones that regulate digestive activities in the other parts of the gastrointestinal tract. So for instance, if a really high acidity food arrives at one part of the tract, that part of the tract might release a hormone that stimulates some later part of the gastrointestinal tract to produce more of a basic alkaline substance to neutralize the acid. So hormones are functioning as this internal communication system within the gastrointestinal tract. I'm really excited to get into the digestive system because it is an absolutely incredible system. So I know that I've presented a lot of details here. What to focus on for the lecture portion of the endocrine system is knowing the endocrine glands and organs, where they are in the body, know the hormones that they produce, and in just a few words, be able to describe the function of those hormones. So don't get bogged down into the details. I know your book provides a lot of details. Just be able to describe them as I've described them here. And please let me know if you run into any questions.